This screencast will be about qualitative research and will include a little break for you to work on an activity. So qualitative research, as you remember, is research that deals primarily with narrative data as opposed to numerical data. Numerical data is dealt with by quantitative research. So some of the strengths of qualitative research are that it's often used to help us learn more about things we don't know. So it's used for what's called exploratory research. And here's where I disagree a little bit with the textbook. The textbook talks about qualitative research as something that's useful when we know very little or nothing about a topic, as a way of directing us to what we should study quantitatively next. However, I can think of a lot of examples. Some of the best qualitative research, in my opinion, has been done about topics we already know a lot about. So an example is some of the disparities research that I work with. We knew for a very long time we had robust, high-quality quantitative data showing us that people who are members of historically marginalized communities access less health care and have poorer outcomes than people who are members of historically privileged groups. But we didn't know why, and we didn't know exactly what was going on that would explain the results we had proven time and time again using quantitative research. And it wasn't until we started doing qualitative research that we began to understand some of the reasons why. So for example, qualitative research helps us get a really in-depth understanding or understand the nuances of discrimination in healthcare, which is really hard to demonstrate quantitatively. So the wave of the future, the trends in the research world, is for us to do what's called mixed methods research, which is research, exactly like it sounds, that mixes qualitative and quantitative methods. And to me, there's something very social work-like about documenting people's perceptions and responses in their own words and using people's narratives and descriptions of themselves and their realities, their worlds, as our data that really fits well with social work. So that's some of the reasons to consider doing qualitative research. So in theory, there is a process for qualitative research that begins when a question arises. We turn to the literature, look for some justification and background knowledge in order to hone the question and figure out what research methods would best answer that question. Then we collect and analyze data and reconsider the theory that we found from the literature. I will say that in my experience as a qualitative researcher, the process can start at any place in this wheel. So I've worked on projects where as we're analyzing the data we've collected, brand new questions arise. And so we go back to that data and consider it again in terms of a new question, in terms of the new question. So I find when I give this presentation for physicians, I frame this a little bit differently. But for you, I will say that social workers tend to be really good qualitative researchers because it uses a lot of the same skill set in that you're collecting data directly from people. So you're building conversations and relationships, and that tends to be something that social workers are great at. A quality that's also really important for good qualitative research is reflexivity, knowing yourself, your experiences, your background, your assumptions, and how that might impact your analysis of qualitative research. Because as we'll discuss in a little bit, a really important way of increasing the rigor of qualitative research is reflexivity, is knowing what biases you bring to the table. We all have biases. So as we've talked about previously, qualitative research can use several techniques. You can have interviews, focus groups, observations, and as well as other newer, more participatory qualitative techniques like photo voice, which you read about in the Mejia et al. Article for homework, which is posted on Canvas. Digital storytelling, other techniques as well. We're going to focus today on interviews and focus groups. We talked a little bit about observation. Some of the advantages of it are it's fairly easy to do. Some of the disadvantages of it are that people tend to act differently when they know they're being watched. If they don't know they're being watched, there's some ethical issues that's at play. People, need to be able to give informed consent to participate in research, and if they're being observed without their knowledge, they categorically haven't given that informed consent. And then also, for me, for many other researchers I know, there's something we take issue with the idea of, as researchers, interpreting people's behaviors rather than simply asking them what's happening, what they felt, rather than trying to interpret it ourselves. I'm going to try to play a video of a focus group.
Thanks very much for joining us today, guys.
Your feedback is so important. Oh.
Well, you seem to have met already.
Yeah,
That's good.
yeah.
So we can skip the get to know each other exercises
That's
we were going to
right.
do. We're going to be talking about lots of Big Lots pet products, toys, chewies.
Oh.
Well, okay, we will be taking a break at some point.
How many of you...
Okay, wait for the question
If you
first.
could just give us a second.
Now, Boots, you put on your survey that you're very into chewy toys, so particularly interested in your response. If everyone could stand in their chairs.
Do any of you suffer from bad breath?
Halitosis. Okay, Bianca, we're going to try some different colors on you, so let's just get this one off. And okay, Boots, I'm working here. Okay. You can only answer once. Big Lots has lots of American Kennel Club products. These are forest friends, though they wouldn't be your friend if you were chewing on them. Wouldn't want to play with a skunk squeaky toy. Or a pencil. Those are also fun. Okay, guys, you see in front of you a couple of different water bowl options. There's a blue one and there's a green one. If it's not too forward of me, what breed are you? Okay, you don't have to answer that question.
What do you think of this, Boots?
Oh, that's stylish. Do you go to a lot of formal events? You know, you can get those pencils at Big Lots, but they're not in the pet department. Is purple your color? Okay, Boots, seriously? Don't worry, Tops, we're going to get to you in a minute. You guys have any preference between those two bowls, which you'd be more likely to drink water out of? Okay, well there goes Gus. Whiskas. Kind of a hip street name for whiskers. Should take a pad as well. Okay, Tabitha, I noticed you've been looking a little grumpy so far, so why don't we do some cat toys? Okay, now Fish B is Fish A.
Oh, okay.
Fish A is Fish B. Okay. Now, I've lost track of which one was which. This is kind of the 20-foot party sub of Bones.
Yeah. I think, Bianca, you can handle this all by yourself.
The puppies have kind of liked everything, so that does throw off the curve a little bit. That's pretty much it for today. Great session. We learned a lot. Reception will validate the parking on the way out, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Bianca, but that's all the food we have for today. I wouldn't wear that hat out in public, by the way, Pork Chop.
Okay, I'm so glad that worked. So that's an example of a focus group, which can be used to collect data from multiple people at once. And advantages of focus group techniques is that they can build community. They can also solicit information that might not previously have been shared. For example, if one person shares something, it might invite or make it more comfortable for other people to share too. The disadvantages are that it's much harder to guarantee confidentiality, and people might not feel comfortable sharing with members of their community or members of a group. Which brings us to interviews. As we've talked about before, they can range from structured interviews, which is almost like verbal administration of a survey. So the questions are asked in the same way, in the same order, without any prompting or sort of taking the interview in directions other than exactly what's written on the interview guide. Unstructured interviews are the exact opposite, where the participant really leads the interview. So the interviewer often will ask 2 or 3 really big open-ended questions, and the participants, what they share will guide the interview. Most commonly used is semi-structured interviews, which are almost co-led by the participant and the interviewer. There's a lot of turn-taking. The interviewer will ask follow-up questions and will kind of go where the participant's going, and then also bring the participant back to what they want to talk about. So there's more give and take in a semi-structured interview. And the examples we'll be working with later both use semi-structured interviewing. So some interview tips are be prepared. For example, when I was doing some interviews about resources for people with autism in the greater Boston area, I did some research beforehand so I could become familiar with some of the acronyms for the different agencies, so that I did less interrupting of participants to say, oh, can you tell me what DLC stands for? Start with general questions before you launch into questions that could be emotional or personal. And the way we often structure interview guides is to first come up with a set of constructs. So constructs are concepts that I want to know about. So for example, what is the impact of having a dog on your quality of life? And then I'll have 4 or 5 questions that speak to that construct. And in a semi-structured interview, I might only need to ask one of them. Some people like very open-ended questions. So how does having a dog impact your quality of life? And that might be all that's needed to get at that construct in that particular interview. Or some people do better with more structured questions like, what are the pros of having a dog? What are some of the cons? How has having a dog changed over time? What's your relationship like? Practicing beforehand is good, and also keeping questions, avoiding yes or no questions, or questions that can be answered with less than a sentence. And sometimes that comes down to phrasing. So rather than saying, does poverty impact young mothers? Saying, tell me about the ways poverty impacts young mothers, and you'll get more information. We also use a lot of prompts and redirects. Can you expand on that? Can you give me an example? Help me understand more, etc. As we've talked about, research can be inductive or deductive. And the mnemonic I always use is inductive, begins with a vowel, as does observation. So in inductive research, we're starting with our observations, what we're seeing in front of us, or our data. We're looking for patterns in that data, coming up with a hypothesis, and using that to develop a theory. In deductive research, we're starting with a theory, and we're collecting data in order to prove or disprove our theory. And so in qualitative research, whether we're using inductive or deductive approaches often impacts the kind of analysis we'll use. So in deductive research, we're starting with a theory, and we often use a style of qualitative analysis called content analysis, which means we come up with a pre-existing set of codes or categories that we think data might fall into. And then as we read through our interview transcripts or our focus group transcripts, or even look at our observations we've written down, we then plug what we're seeing into the categories we've already built. With inductive qualitative research, we often use an analysis method called grounded theory, which means we start with the observations, and as we read through the transcripts, we come up with we categorize it on the spot and come up with the categories we think it falls into, rather than having those categories pre-built. So that's content analysis, the deductive method, and grounded theory, the inductive method. And you'll have a chance to try both of these in a minute. And so in talking about qualitative data and organizing it, we start with what are called codes. So those are almost tags or identifying anchors that we give data. And often they're based on just directly what was said. So a participant describes feeling anxious about their first meeting with a social worker. We might code that as anxiety or first meeting. So we're just describing the data. Then as we move along, we'll organize the codes into themes. So, for example, a theme might be emotions. So along with the code about anxiety, we might also have a code for feeling hopeful. And those codes might fall into the theme of emotions experienced about first social work appointment. That allows us to group our data a little bit more broadly than the simple codes or tags that we're using. Then themes are organized into second level themes. And so this is really where we start looking at relationships between themes. So for example, if we had a theme about emotions experienced when first meeting at first social work appointment, and we might have a theme called conditions occurring in people's lives or context of people's lives. And we might look at the relationship between the emotion that one feels at the first social work visit and the context of one's life. So what's the relationship between feeling anxious at your first social work visit and having a lot of external stressors in one's life? And that's done with second level themes. So in interpreting qualitative data, we're looking, it can be a very immersive process. So we're reading through all the transcripts, looking for patterns, making comparisons as we go, and then checking back in with ourselves, that reflexivity piece that's so important, with our team, and with what's called member checking, or going back to the participants, to the communities you're working with and saying, am I understanding this correctly? And for me personally, as a qualitative researcher, I'm very committed to member checking or participant feedback. I can think of many, many times when I was interpreting something incorrectly and checking back with the community, fix that problem, and therefore made my research much more valid and much more useful to real people. And then I think I also feel strongly ethically that if I'm going to be describing something that a community lives with, that community is actually the real experts in that issue, and it's really, really important to have their feedback and their involvement in my data analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about how I organize my codes. There's software available for qualitative analysis. Personally, I'm not a big fan, both because it's expensive and takes up a lot of room on your hard drive, and also because I am a big fan of using Excel. So when I'm coding a project, doing a coding project or qualitative analysis project, I'll set up an Excel sheet just like this one, where the rows contain a code, and once I'm done with coding, I will then assign each code to a theme. So for example, codes 1 and 2 were reflective of theme A, and I'll fill in the theme afterwards as the codes are developed. Or if I'm doing content analysis, the themes may have already been developed. And then in each row, I will put quotes from the transcript that I've tagged with that code. So for example, if I was reading a transcript about people's experiences beginning counseling with a social worker, and my theme A was emotions experienced, and code 1 could be anxiety, code 2 could be hope. So if the first person I interview says, well, when I first met my social worker, I was feeling really hopeful, that quote would go in the box for code 1. And so on with all the interviews. And then you can use the Excel sort functions to get the codes to highlight information that you need. And so this is my method for managing qualitative data. So now let's try it. Posted on Canvas, there is a worksheet called Zombie Coding Activity. And your first 2 pages of that packet or that worksheet contain 5 snippets from interviews of people's experiences with their first encounters with zombies. And there's a code book. The 3rd page of that packet is a code book that's been already built by a literature search that I totally, completely actually did, because there is so much existing research evidence about first encounters with zombies. If this were a real qualitative project using content analysis, you would have a code book that was already built from a theory or from your review of the literature, or both. So take a few minutes now to read through the first 2 pages of this worksheet and look at the codes that have already been built for you. And as you read through, write down the codes just right on top of the text. Tag the text with the code that you think applies. So take a few minutes to do that and restart the video when you're done. So, welcome back. So in applying content analysis, one thing that often comes up is that there can be a lot of disagreement. So in a particular passage, for example, do you tag this as using one of the codes about emotional responses, or do you tag it with one of the codes about intellectual responses? Do you think attempted understanding, or the code about meaning making best apply to this passage? The answer is there's really no right answers. And this highlights the importance of a process of, as a team, coding together or coding separately and then comparing with members of your team and really talking about when one team member coded it differently from another, having a discussion about what made you choose to code it in this way rather than this way, and reconciling those differences. That's a process called intercoder reliability or intercoder agreement. And it's important going into a project to have already talked with your team and have a process for settling disagreements between coders. One tip that I often use when I'm working on a qualitative project, I try to find the person in my office who is least similar to me to make sure that I'm really getting a diversity of opinions and a diversity of perspectives. And that really, I think, helps me highlight or be more precise in my coding through that discussion with a colleague who is different from me. I also really value my colleagues who have similar approaches, but I learn more from my colleagues as a general rule who have different approaches. Another thing to think about in content analysis is what happens with outliers, so experiences that are very different from the norm. So in the 5 interviews snippets that you read, there wasn't anyone who said, I was really, really happy to see the zombies. My spouse had previously become undead and I thought I would never see them again. So that person would be an outlier because their experience was different from the majority. And content analysis is not, sometimes the existing codes that have already been developed don't fit the outlier. And so at that point, you either have to go in and add new codes and adjust, or you have to think carefully with your team about how to analyze the outliers. Oftentimes in qualitative research, the outliers teach you the most or make for really important analysis. It should be said, too, that often content analysis codebooks will change over time. So while the codebook isn't being built completely from scratch during the coding process or the analysis process, it is being changed. Okay, so let's do another activity. This time we're going to try grounded coding, which is the inductive method of analysis in qualitative data. So again, on your worksheet, if you turn the page 1, you will see a 2-page transcript titled Interview 5. And this is a slightly longer snippet of an interview about the zombie apocalypse of 2016. And with this, you don't have a code book pre-built. So if you turn to the last page in your packet, you'll just see an empty sheet. And that's for you to fill in codes. And I would recommend first filling in codes and then later going back and thinking about how the codes might group together in broader themes. We won't worry about second level themes right now. And I would read the transcript over once just to get a sense of the story, to kind of immerse yourself in this data. And then on your second read, make notes about what codes you might apply to different quotes and passages, thinking about what's important, what you want to highlight in this information. In every interview I've ever conducted, there have been times that people share information that doesn't end up being coded because it's not really related to the subject. And it's also okay to have what's called a wildcard theme. So when you see a passage or a quote that you think is important, but you're not quite sure how to tag it, put it into a wildcard theme that you then go back to as the codebook continues to develop. So take some time to do that, code through at least the first page, and come back to the video, hit play on the video again when you're done doing that. Okay, welcome back. So in trying grounded theory, personally, I love grounded theory. I love coding with grounded theory. It reminds me a lot of getting to sleep in on a Sunday morning and read my book when I wake up. I get that I'm sort of in a minority about this, how much I enjoy coding. But I think some of the advantages we see in grounded theory is that we're being very, very true to what the participant is saying. Some disadvantages are it can be very subjective. We're really bringing in our own biases, which is why reflexivity, again, is so important. An interesting point that came up in class that someone raised was that grounded theory can seem fairly unreliable because so much depends on the researcher's interpretation of terms, which is absolutely true. A lot does depend on the researcher's interpretation. However, in quantitative research, we have that same kind of dependency on interpretation and that same uncertainty and subjectivity, but it's on the part of the participant. So if I'm doing a quantitative survey and I ask participants whether or not they are satisfied with their social work care, and a participant says that they're satisfied, I bet if we went around in a circle and asked all 22 members of our class to define satisfaction with care, every person would say something slightly different. So there's no one universal meaning for a concept like satisfaction with care. And so in that kind of study, the uncertainty or subjectivity would be on the part of the participant. Where in qualitative research, particularly inductive qualitative analysis, we already know, we have much more details about how the participant defines satisfaction. And the uncertainty is present among researchers that we can talk about with our research group and reconcile. So in some ways, the uncertainty and subjectivity is a little bit more upfront and therefore potentially easier to reconcile. Grounded coded theory tends to be a little bit better than content analysis for responding to outliers because you're making the codes as you go. And so in real time, you're able to come up with the codes that apply to outliers. I think it's also important to note in grounded coding or grounded theory coding that one's own positionality and bias and one's research question really determine what's being analyzed for. So for example, if you were working at as an economist, and this was a qualitative study done to inform a financial or economic analysis of the zombie apocalypse, the parts of the transcript that you would view as most important to code, or that you would probably spend the most time analyzing, would be things related to the economy. So, for example, when the cashier gives the zombie the free slice of pizza, and then also when the interviewee goes underground and lives in the tunnels and is therefore not going to work. So what would be most important to you to code for would have to do with economic impacts. Whereas if you were a sociologist, the free pizza thing probably wouldn't make it that far into your code book, and you would be looking at emotions experienced, and the part about working together as a group would probably be really important to you, and you would be coding to try to understand how, or doing this analysis to try to understand how people in the zombie apocalypse formed societies and protected each other. So your perspective, again, is incredibly important to be aware of, and to really spend time thinking about your research question, your purpose, and your assumptions. Some other ways to make qualitative data more rigorous include, as we've talked about, reflexivity, respondent verification, or member checking, going back to your interviewees or your community. Triangulation of data, which is, seeking out multiple sources of data to confirm what you're seeing in your samples. So, for example, I worked on a project a while ago about the qualitative arm of a project looking at why adults with intellectual disabilities were getting far fewer mammograms than other adults their age. And one thing we heard from when we interviewed adults with intellectual disabilities, one thing they said quite often was lack of transportation, not having a way of getting to the mammogram facility. And then we triangulated that data by doing a few interviews with family members of adults with intellectual disabilities. And the family members triangulated that, or said the same thing. When we talked with the family members, we heard a lot of people saying, yeah, so my adult daughter is in her 50s. I know she should be getting regular mammograms. But now that I'm 80, I don't drive as much anymore, and it's much harder for me to take her to medical appointments like I used to. So that triangulated our data. And then making really strategic decisions about who to sample. Remember that most qualitative research uses purposive rather than random sampling. So making sure that we're talking with the people we need to be talking with who have the most knowledge or insight about the issue at hand. And in qualitative analysis, we're looking for what's called saturation, or the point at which we stop hearing new information. And then conducting and coding and analyzing a few interviews past that point of saturation. As I said, people use software programs sometimes for coding. And that has been our screencast about qualitative data.